Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson. I'm here with my co-host, Alyssa Polizzi, and today we are joined by the infamous Sam Hinds. Sam Hinds is a clinical psychology doctoral student who is training in ketamine-assisted therapy. I hope I have that right. Today we'll be discussing psychedelic experiences through the Jungian lens.
All right, so our discussion with Sam is going to be followed by an audience Q&A. So if you've got some questions for him, feel free to throw it in the chat. This will be recorded and put up on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on camera or have your voice captured, just let us know and we'll ask the question for you. And since this is being recorded to YouTube, we ask that you keep your video off during our discussion and we'll turn it back on a little bit later. All right, so let's get started. Welcome, Sam. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well today, and yeah, it's good to chat with you both again. Happy to be here.
Yes, we are very happy to have you on the Golden Shadow, and I wanted to kick off our discussion today kind of on 2 points. The first one being when we consider psychedelics from a Jungian point of view, there's more of the classic idea of Jung's approach to psychedelics being maybe less than favorable. There is some correspondences that you can read through his letters. It's not necessarily something he wrote about in like the collected works per se, but rather, you know, when inquired about, say, like mescaline or other psychedelics, he felt that it could be a little overwhelming for individuals, that kind of floodgate that could open up to the unconscious could produce all of these images and feelings and possibly even activate latent psychosis, all these different dynamics that for him made him seem wary of the efficacy of psychedelics and rather steered individuals towards this slower process of working with and integrating unconscious material through active imagination. So there's that tension that we see with the classic Jungian thought of, you know, psychedelics equals maybe not so good, but then we have all of this modern viewpoints on it, how it's being integrated into the clinical space. So what are your views, you know, as a more modern Jungian on psychedelics, and how do we reconcile Jung's views from, you know, many, many decades ago?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it is true that Jung was wary of psychedelics at best. Despite some letters where he spoke about it, there were a couple of places, mostly in his writings on psychosis, where he would bring up mescaline, largely speculating on whether there is some kind of endogenous neurotoxin that actually gives rise to what we recognize as psychosis. I think a good place to enter the controversy is around this word of integration, because you hear that a lot in kind of psychedelic culture, like psychedelic integration. How are you working with the integration of your recent trip or recent psychedelic experience? And integration with a specific sort of meaning is actually really central to Jung's psychology. For Jung's psychedelic for psychological development is a progressive process of integration. And that's what analysis or therapy is aiming at, is to help assist the kind of ongoing integrative process that is actually part of the development of psychological growth itself. And the way that that would naturally occur is that the developing individual or the will have to incorporate more of their own wholeness, more of their own totality, usually through first a confrontation with certain aspects of one's own personality that had been negated, rejected, or ignored. We call that the shadow, largely because it's not compatible with our ego ideal, or the kind of values around which we construct our sense of self. And that's often it can be a painful and difficult process in itself. We're often very defended against that and usually project those things outward first before we have to slowly come to own them. Jung's caution, he recognized, and this was actually recognized very early on when say LSD was first, it was synthesized by Albert Hofmann in the late 30s. And then in the earlier 40s, the infamous day, Bicycle Day, he accidentally dosed himself, and that was the first acid trip in history. He worked for a pharmaceutical company called Sandoz Labs in Basel, Switzerland. And what they quickly discovered was that individuals who kind of take LSD often will have experiences of kind of forgotten memories coming up, insights into their personality, or things that have not been conscious for a long time kind of coming to the surface. So Sandoz Labs was the first to kind of come forward and say, this might be an aid to psychiatry. Started sending out samples of LSD to various psychiatrists or mental hospitals. And actually in the 40s, psychedelics were originally called psychotomimetics. That was a term that was initially used for psychedelics because there was a sense that, especially the higher you get in dose, the more the experiences that were being reported by people or experienced by people were so foreign. So they seemed to have a kind of hallucinatory quality. People were thinking these seem to maybe mimic what we recognize as psychosis. So actually clinicians taking psychedelics might have insight into what psychotic experience is like. Now that slowly kind of shifted as certain distinguishing qualities between at least a lot of what's recognized as psychosis and psychedelic experience started becoming more apparent. So Jung's concern was that the psyche needs to have a certain degree of, or at least the ego has to have a certain degree of strength or maturity, in his view, to be able to assimilate those aspects of self that have not quite been assimilated, integrated into the ego. He felt that with what's going on with psychedelics is that the barrier between conscious and unconscious gets softened, right? There's this phrase from the French psychologist Pierre Janet, who is very influential on both Freud and Jung and the birth of depth psychology itself. And it's a French term. I might not be pronouncing it Frenchly enough, but it's abaissement du niveau mental. That sometimes roughly translates to like a lowering of the threshold of consciousness. And so that essentially means to be a self, or to have a sense of I at all, usually entails that certain things are being kind of brought into that sphere of the ego. And the idea is that the psyche is much bigger than that. It includes a lot more content, a lot more material, but that's not all crossing the barrier into that sense of I, or that sense of awareness. And that can be called the threshold of consciousness. That idea actually goes back even further to Gustav Theodor Fechner, who's known as like the father of experimental psychology. And so actually the way that he started kind of approaching this idea is that he would work with physical stimuli. This is like the beginning when kind of like scientific experiments with the psyche were starting to begin. And they would do things like put a needle tip on somebody's finger and see how much pressure is needed before the individual actually becomes aware of the sensation. So it's this idea that something's going on with the body. At some level, it's probably registering in the body, but at what point does it cross the threshold to become a percept or become an actual object of experience? So that's actually kind of a physical process. But the idea is that, well, actually with the psyche itself, the psyche's much bigger than we're aware of at any moment. And there's actually a barrier that certain contents need to cross before we become aware of an interior content, right? So Jung's concern was that taking psychedelics will induce an abaissement du niveau mental. It'll lower the threshold of consciousness. The individual will become aware of much more of the totality of the psyche than they ordinarily are. And they might be confronted with a lot of content that the ego is not ready or mature enough to integrate yet. He really wanted to work, he thought it was a very slow process. Things need to be kind of assimilated and integrated in a natural way. And that itself is a difficult process. That's what psychoanalysis for him, or analytic work, was really about. So his concern was that, yeah, it's just going to flood the individual. It might actually be kind of damaging or harmful. The individual might be faced with things that they're just not integrated and mature enough yet to fully experience and assimilate. Michael Fordham, the British analyst, tended to agree with Jung here. Now, that has sort of colored that colored the kind of classical Jungian attitude in general to psychedelics for a lot of decades. He found that, like, in the kind of Jungian community, based on Jung's commentary on this, that was sort of how the general opinion sort of coalesced. But there were two analysts from England, Ronald Sanderson and Margot Kuttner. They were early Jungian analysts in the and in the 1950s, Ronald Sanderson actually went and met Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Labs, got introduced to LSD, and started working with it. And in the classical Jungian world, at least, Sanderson and Kuttner are the two kind of dissenting opinions about the efficacy of psychedelics. Sanderson in the 50s started the first LSD analytic work, and was working with a lot of patients with LSD. And he actually had a different opinion. He actually he thought that psychedelics could actually be beneficial, especially with cases that are usually more difficult to treat. But for them, it was just a matter of, it's not so much that the psychedelic experience and the confrontation with unconscious material itself is intrinsically harmful. What's important is that the individuals who are going through this have a sufficient amount of therapeutic support, that they actually have a strong analyst who can kind of be present with them, help them do the assimilating. They had a lot of trust that that whatever was encountered, if contained well enough in a strong supportive therapeutic relationship could actually be beneficial. And they found that after doing decades and hundreds to thousands of LSD treatments, that nobody seemed to be irrevocably damaged. There were no eruptions of latent psychosis, which would have been Jung's concern. Jung was concerned about that with active imagination with a lot of people. He was actually cautious about who to even engage in that process with. So Jung's caution about psychedelics is actually reflective of his caution about the power and potency of the archetypal psyche just itself by any means. So it's a broader concern there.
Yeah, I like this point you're bringing up, because the sort of danger of starting to dip into the unconscious space is something that you do see throughout his work. This kind of cautioning of doing active imagination and engaging the unconscious material. I'm curious if you view, say, dreams or active imagination in the imagery and the themes that come forward as similar or parallel to what comes forward in psychedelic experiences, and can we analyze them then similarly?
Absolutely. So Jung used that term, abaissement du niveau mental, lowering the threshold, to describe what's happening with psychedelics, to describe what is happening when you're engaging in active imagination. You actually deliberately kind of enter a relaxed state of consciousness that lowers that threshold, and the fantasy material that begins to surface, which is archetypal in nature, is the same unconscious content that's being disclosed, but probably more radically and kind of less voluntarily in a psychedelic experience, especially at very high doses. He also thought that that's what's going on in sleep, that there's an abaissement that happens and the archetypal material of the deep psyche comes forward in dreams. So all of those are quite analogous. And for, Jung in particular had an attitude about the archetypal contents of the unconscious, that they both sometimes provide very necessary healing and formative properties when the ego or when the developing psyche is in a point of crisis. And at the same time, they can have a possessive effect. If the ego is not strong, the archetypal powers or images that kind of have an animated autonomy to them can actually shatter the ego, displace it, usurp it. And that's that the individual either gets possessed by modes of behavior and perception that kind of displace the will and autonomy of the ego, and sometimes can be quite destructive, or just otherwise can kind of create a chaotic mass confusion that we call psychosis. Yeah, that was Jung's standpoint.
I can imagine like having a sort of like cross-training regimen where you do active imagination and you do dream analysis and you kind of like develop a literacy of that. And then you also like have psychedelics as an option. And as far as psychedelic therapy goes, do they recommend that people kind of get in touch with these practices like dream analysis and active imagination as preparation for psychedelics? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one thing to say is that, Jung died in 1961. One has to wonder how his views might have developed if he had been around to see the progression of research with psychedelic assisted therapy, the actual data on how people respond to it, how the concerns he had are not actually very common at all in terms of being realized. So like Stanislav Grof, who is one of the pioneers of LSD psychotherapy, has a lot of literature on this. And it seems like while there are things to be cautious, I don't want to downplay that there are things to be cautious about with psychedelics, definitely. But my sense is that working with folks who are coming in for psychedelic assisted therapy, if they have experience with, say, dream work or active imagination, especially exercising that sort of metaphorical or symbolic kind of way of looking at the contents that emerge and the growth and integrative processes that can happen there, might put people on good footing. But I also think that if they just enter a good therapeutic relationship, they're well supported, that it's not a necessary prerequisite. But the idea is that the integrative process, we would generally work with that in the same way that we're going to work with dreams, or that way that we're going to work with any sort of imaginative content. And there is an array of orientations and actual attitudes about the best way to work with images. Some that kind of more follow Jung's vision of, say, so for instance, Margot Kuttner, who I mentioned earlier, who's one of the early analysts in the 50s, looked at a lot of what she actually wrote, I think one of the earliest, probably the first paper ever in the Jungian literature on LSD psychotherapy. I think it was published in like 1959. And the conclusion that Kuttner came to is that the imagery that appears in a psychedelic assisted therapy session, like Jung thought of often of dreams and fantasy material, compensates the conscious attitude, so that whatever kind of disposition that the conscious attitude is holding, the imagery is going to be pointing to a complementary perspective that sort of balances and compensates for where the conscious personality is, and will bring it into greater balance. That's not always the case. You can take more of a Hillmanian or archetypal view, which kind of just stays with the richness of the image. Feels like the image is sort of ambiguous, it's poetic, it's metaphorical, but really just contemplating it, staying with it, it has all the information that's needed and probably has a whole wealth of ambiguous meaning, but that really just kind of staying with it, contemplating it, turning it over, will kind of give the sustenance and nourishment that the psyche needs. I've actually kind of found with my own work with ketamine-assisted therapy that perspective is actually very valuable. And sometimes you find that the image itself, when you just approach it, is extremely rich, has a lot of information, and even kind of bring like, I don't want to bring forward any specific material from any of my clients just because I haven't really gotten their permission to do that yet. But I can say that in my experience, sometimes there are very particular random seeming images that are puzzling that come up during a session. Just asking the client in a kind of active imagination sort of way in subsequent integration sessions to return to the image. There's so much information in it. And at times, I often notice that just feeling into the image, it seems to almost have its own, it has an inward dimension. It's not just a visual image. There are attitudes, emotions, dispositions that seem to kind of be enfolded into the information that these images carry forward. And a lot of times it seems to be exactly what the person needs at that moment. And by encouraging them to feel into it, they're accessing parts of themselves that are latent and ready to come forward.
I'm wondering, Sam, if you could explain, maybe for those who are listening, who might not be very familiar with psychedelic therapy, what is this process like? Are you kind of pulling upon maybe like micro doses of the drug to sort of ease people into this experience? And are there any sort of differences between using something like MDMA versus ketamine? What are the sort of pros and cons of one versus the other? How might one approach just even wanting to look more deeply into this style of therapy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And to focus on MDMA versus ketamine, there are certainly differences there. Also with what are more called classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. While from a Jungian standpoint, the thing that all of these things have in common is that they all have the capacity to kind of bring forward previously unconscious material. MDMA in particular has certain neurological effects, like for instance, it inhibits the activity of the amygdala in the brain, and that's what kind of controls emotions and especially the fear response. And it also promotes the, not only promotes like production of serotonin in the brain, but also certain neurochemicals that are bound up with attachment and bonding, that all kind of gets released. So that's why it's particularly good working with trauma, because the fear response is damped down so people can revisit previously unconscious memories that are really traumatic, and usually going there kind of activates the sympathetic nervous system. It can sometimes be almost re-traumatizing if it's not well contained. Also, those positive chemicals help them, kind of bond with the presence of the therapist. So it really helps people reconnect with very painful, sometimes excruciating memories, and helps them integrate them. So there's kind of a whole biological support there. Ketamine actually can work with trauma in a whole a different way. Ketamine, in my opinion, is like the weird sibling of the psychedelic family, because it works on a very different kind of biological network than other psychedelics do, and it's classified as a dissociative anesthetic. It was actually first used as for anesthesia purposes, and the whole history of how its psychedelic properties were first discovered and introduced is a really interesting story. I'm not going to veer off on that right away, but there seems to be something in ketamine about inducing dissociation in the present while also lowering the barrier of the threshold of consciousness. Not only allows unconscious memories to come forward, sometimes memories of trauma, but that dissociative property helps somebody get a little bit of distance from what's coming up. It's almost like a an optimal introduction of dissociation to also be able to be present with the material without being so gripped and being so deeply in it. So in both of these cases, you see how each of these chemicals have properties that help facilitate the integration of painful material in unique ways. And it also seems to be an accelerator pad in some ways for just what happens naturally during therapy, because there seems to be, Jung's idea about what goes on in therapy or analysis is that the drive of the psyche that always moves towards wholeness. It's like the psyche itself has a deep, ingrained natural tendency toward assimilation over time. Something about the therapeutic situation seems to kind of support and activate that wholeness driving part of the psyche. And things are going to naturally kind of, whatever's in the unconscious that is at the threshold or ready to come up or prepared, that setting's going to facilitate that. What happens in psychedelic therapy is you're bringing in compounds that actually soften that barrier of the unconscious, and it just catalyzes the process. You find that things will come up that that would probably have taken a long time to get to under natural circumstances. Sometimes it can be a lot, and there is a degree of caution and discernment that's needed there on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, so basically psychedelic therapy, in my view, at least at its first level, because we can go deeper and deeper with this and what's actually going on in psychedelic experience. But I like to call it like a catalyst or an accelerator of the natural therapeutic and integrative process. Yeah.
What are the kind of let's say scenarios in which psychedelics becomes necessary? Like the issues that someone has that they cannot make progress on through normal therapy. What's the kind of problem someone might have, or the kind of trauma they might have that really needs psychedelics to break through? And I guess the question is why? Why does it not work without sort of this like artificial lowering of the threshold, you might say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And my initial response would probably be to say that I don't know if psychedelics ever become necessary. And I think that there probably are other modalities and lots of other options for healing that also have potential and can be useful. Psychedelics, in a lot of cases and for different reasons, can be helpful and can be advisable. One of the probably central examples in MDMA came up earlier is with post-traumatic stress disorder, because these are extreme states of trauma, and they're very, it's difficult to work with, it's difficult to heal. It's absolutely possible, and it's possible by other means. It just takes, it takes a lot of support. Extreme trauma can be kind of profound and devastating to the soul and to the body. And MDMA in particular, just with its kind of neuroactive properties, just adds this scaffolding and support along a number of lines, like multiple factors at once that just seem to hold and support the integration of trauma in a beautiful way. That's why the studies that MAPS is bringing forward with working with, say, MDMA, with combat veterans with PTSD, people with PTSD from other forms of trauma, it's just showing a lot of success. Aside from that, in the same way that you can ask, when does therapy become necessary? It's usually when your neurosis explodes and starts messing with your life. That's why I started it initially. And yet, at least especially from a Jungian standpoint, I think probably more than most other forms of therapy, the value of analytic work goes beyond just healing. It goes beyond just trying to kind of be less troubled by your neurosis. After a while, it actually becomes becoming who you are. And that's, that can be a container for actually discovering that image that is within you that has a transpersonal source and grounding that is trying to express itself, like the sleeping oak in the acorn that is struggling to express itself. The idea is that we all have that. That is part of being human. That is the nature of the psyche. Analytic work can help facilitate that process. Healing is always in service of that. And I don't think any of us get out of being wounded, or any of us get out of being neurotic. I think that's actually part of the mystery of becoming. Psychedelics, are just like therapy can be an option to help facilitate that, to help open things up. They're medicine in a broader and deeper sense in that way.
The psychedelic and drugs, really, the accessibility of them continue to grow, it seems, at least. And there's also this kind of notion, if you start to view the types of drugs that people are getting their hands on, that as technology progresses, so do the psychedelics. They become more powerful. We find some new versions like 5-MeO DMT as an example. And what are your viewpoints on utilizing these types of drugs recreationally, where we don't have that container of the therapeutic space, or necessarily a community to support you through that integration process? It feels sometimes like we're playing with fire when we're picking up these substances and utilizing them without the assistance to assimilate what comes forward.
It's such an important point and question. And I'm noticing that the response that's coming up from me feels so Jungian, in the sense that it's ambivalent and paradoxical, because psychedelics, any individual psychedelic experience can both be so opening and healing, and it can be painful and shattering. And I don't want to overlook that side of it. And one thing that's even difficult is that, for instance, with people who are aware that they have a lot of trauma, any kind of complex trauma, especially, I would really encourage being very cautious with these substances, making sure that there is adequate support, whether with a sitter or a guide, and just having strong supports in your life, whether it's family, friends, community, to kind of help hold you, because you don't know what's going to come up. But this is also what's difficult, right? Is that I know that there are people who have complex forms of trauma, and sometimes they take psychedelics and just have a beautiful experience. And I don't want to deny that that is possible and cast too pessimistic a light on what's possible, and say, if you have trauma, like, it's just not going to be good. Don't go there, because I've seen and witnessed otherwise. And that's not to diminish the caution and care, right, that's needed to engage with these substances. I've personally had very shattering experiences with psychedelics, and what's really kind of puzzling and paradoxical there is I don't know whether to interpret that in a positive or negative light for myself. Would I have been better off if that didn't happen? Just because what came forward was in some ways pretty shattering to where I was at in my development at that time. It was painful. The process of integration was slow and arduous in some ways. I don't know whether I'm worse off for it or not. In some ways, I think that there was something valuable. It might have happened more slowly and organically had I just not done that, and then just gone along my course of development as it would have naturally unfolded. And yet there was something significant that did happen in that experience for me. It does kind of exemplify the compensatory quality that Jung talks about, as I've looked back and kind of reflected on what was going on there. So I think the most responsible answer is to say, approach these things with caution. If you are isolated, or if you struggle with trauma, or just don't know what you're going to encounter, be careful. Everyone has their own right to approach these substances and medicines as they feel inclined. I strongly believe that, but it is not something to take very lightly, because it really can open up and disclose and bring forward things that can be very difficult to work with, and in some cases might be destabilizing, might be quite traumatic, right? So in some ways it's important that I mean, in some ways this also just kind of, I think, points to that the condition of atomization and the loss of community structures and strong kind of kinship networks of support that kind of constitute the modern condition itself is a problem that probably needs some healing on a collective level. But yeah, I think the most important thing is just, make sure that you have strong networks of support in places where you can be held in your life if you're going to be endeavoring to experiment with these substances, because that can be so important. It's really hard to have a shattering experience and then be isolated in it and potentially dangerous. Yeah.
This is a bit of a segue, but Alyssa brought up 5-MeO DMT, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on ego death, or like what is really happening with ego death. And I've never experienced it personally, but like it seems like people in some sense are still kind of remembering, they're making memories, they're kind of seeing what's happening, and yet at the same time there's no autobiographical I. How do we make sense of ego death? What is that?
Very good and complex question, especially what you named there with the fact that there is still witnessing consciousness that somehow has that once the I reconstitutes itself, once the self comes back together, can kind of have some kind of relationship with what happened, even though the self went away. Stanislav Grof, again, one of the pioneers of LSD psychotherapy in the 1950s and who developed holotropic breathwork later, really points toward ego death as a central part. You can say it's the archetype of death and rebirth in some ways. There's an alchemical dictum in Latin. It's solve et coagula, which means dissolve and coagulate, right? What we call defenses, in kind of psychoanalytic or psychological terms, the part of us that wants to hold certain things away because we just don't want to look at them or because they're painful, seems to just exist on a spectrum with that psychological principle that consolidates into a sense of self, because really the softening of defenses that just let in more of who we are as individuals, if you just carry that process forward and forward and forward, this would be Grof's standpoint. He kind of came to like a more Vedic interpretation, which is our real identity is that we are continuous with the creative principle of the universe itself. Our true identity is, we're one with the divine. And what happened, if you kind of follow through what happens at lower doses of psychedelics, where that barrier, that threshold is just softened a little bit, it will just kind of continue until the consolidation of the sense of I seems to dissolve a bit. There is a kind of deconstitution of the ego identity that happens. Now, what is really valuable about that is that as the ego deconstitutes itself, consciousness seems to open up to more and more and more that goes beyond this kind of relatively limited and reified sense of individual selfhood. That's like the solve, it's the dissolve, right? Now, when the dissolution happens and consciousness opens up to so much more of the content and the material that's there, the coagula side, coagulate, to come back together, can actually bring back and assimilate into the purview of the conscious personality things that have been disclosed, things that have been opened up, that can be as like very valuable to reconstitute one's sense of self around. So it's that kind of dissolve out of that I experience, open up to more of what's there in just the totality of the psyche, ranging from from our kind of personal psychological totality, which extends more than, extends further than we're aware of, and can actually kind of integrate more. It can have archetypal experiences. This brings me to Jeffrey Becker. He's an MD who works with ketamine-assisted therapy, and the way he conceptualized what goes on with ego death, and as it occurs in ketamine-assisted therapy, is he sees it in Jungian terms, with what Edward Edinger described as a restitution of the ego self axis. So there's this idea that our individual selves sort of grow and develop out of a transpersonal ground, and states of depression especially have to do with our ego identity losing sense of contact or continuity with the meaning giving sustenance that actually comes from the transpersonal ground out from which we develop. Edward Edinger saw this as a kind of natural process that actually, when we're first born or in the infantile state, there's a tendency to be still kind of fully identified with that that deeper totality out from which we emerge. And then eventually, as the child grows, it meets with boundaries, meets with limitations, meets with the fact that the child's not actually omnipotent. And there's a fall into alienation. There's a sense of shame, there's a sense of defeat, there's a sense of inferiority that can come with that. But then over time, it's actually the recognition that that fall, that meeting with limitation itself also belongs to the transpersonal ground, that's meant to happen. And while its experience is being alienated from the ultimate, it actually kind of gets incorporated into a broader sense of continuity with the divine that accepts our limitations, accepts the fall from Eden as a necessary part of becoming an individual, and it doesn't mean we're disconnected from the divine. So what Jeffrey Becker views as happening when we have ego death, the self kind of makes contact with that transpersonal ground again. The self-ego access is restored. We kind of have a memory of a deeper, wider, numinous and divine ground of our being. And when the reconstitution of the identity happens, that sense of groundedness and continuity with that transpersonal source can be maintained. And so it's basically being stuck in that alienated state to kind of once again feeling oneself grounded in a deeper source of meaning and purpose, and essentially belonging to the cosmos itself, or to the divine itself. So yeah.
Thank you, Sam. I think we're going to move on to question and answer portion of today's event. So if you would like to ask Sam a question, please make sure to drop it in the chat. And if you'd like to turn your video back on, feel free to do so. I wanted to read a question from Devin, and he said, in your work or history of it, has there been any participants who have inherited an overactive imagination after any number of sessions? And if so, what might the general procedure be afterward to process or repair this issue?
It seems that, Devin had to jump off, so I can't maybe ask him a little clarifying question here. But as far as, individuals inheriting an overactive imagination after any number of sessions, I imagine, at least my sense of what that question might mean is if the therapeutic process itself kind of stimulates or potentiates the imagination in a way where it becomes overactive and maybe flooding. I haven't personally experienced that yet, fortunately. In most cases in my work, the stream of imaginative material does kind of come forward in kind of almost disbursements or dispersals in a way that can be worked with and metabolized at a sustainable pace. I do imagine, I imagine what Jung was cautious about is individuals who probably do have an experience where the unconscious becomes overactivated and the amount of content streaming into consciousness from the archetypal psyche become flooding or overwhelming. I haven't had that experience yet.
Oscar, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, so me and my friend were talking yesterday about psychedelic experiences and seeing eyes, like small little eyes, when having eyes closed, and also like in the trees and in the ceiling, like eyes looking back at you, like they're conscious, like they're like your friend, like your equal, like some other kind of intelligence. And I was thinking about the Turkish evil eye. It's kind of popped into my head when we were talking about it. I was wondering what could this symbol mean? Or I mean, I know that symbols are ultimately personal, but what could they mean since we both had the same experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, Oscar. And my mind does go in multiple directions with this. And one, to say that at least this would be Jung's attitude, right? And this could be played with and questioned, but there's a degree to which Jung would maintain that symbols are impersonal, that actually they issue from a transpersonal source, and that you would find them kind of showing up in different contexts, but maybe having a resonance of meaning. But you brought forward a very particular archetype that this reminded you of, which is the Turkish evil eye, which I think has a situatedness, a context, and probably a very particular meaning. And I don't know that much about that particular image or what it means, but the experience of seeing eyes, especially in nature, on trees, or just in the surround, is not an uncommon experience while on psychedelics. In fact, there are certain Alex Gray paintings. A lot of times there'll be these kind of really trippy, colorful, cosmic depictions where there are eyes everywhere, but he also has one painting that is a depiction of a natural scene, and you see eyes on, kind of eyes looking out of the trees. And I've actually had that experience myself, of trees with just looming eyes looking at me. One way of maybe looking at that is, I think the eye can be can at least be a signification of ensoulment, because where there is an eye, there's a sense of an interiority, or a soul, or an inwardness that's looking out and through the eye. An eye sees, which implies that there's a seer there. And so when we have an experience of seeing eyes everywhere, there's a number of interpretations that can be made, and I honestly don't know, but it almost, for me, seems like it would be the ensoulment of the world, the ensoulment of the cosmos itself, like the anima mundi, the world soul, this idea that soul is not just kind of isolated in the human flesh or confined in the human soul, but pervades everything, and even our ensoulment kind of partakes of and is continuous with a broader worldwide, cosmos deep ensoulment. Perhaps when eyes show up, on whether it's trees or even just any surrounding environment, it's kind of the ensoulment, our participation in a broadly pervasively ensouled world and cosmos, like announcing or symbolizing itself. That's one way you can maybe hold or play with that idea. Yeah.
We have another question from Win. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think my question was already answered, but I had another one. I just wanted to ask what the involvement of nature was in psychedelic assisted therapy. The reason for this is, of course, nature is seen to be healing. And then Jung also mentions that the alchemists, they wanted to preserve the bridge to nature.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Especially at the beginnings of psychedelic therapy. In some ways, after the 60s and everything, we have this kind of really well-known phrase, just like set and setting, right, being really important for the way a psychedelic experience is going to go. And you often find that in people's personal use or their own, whether recreational or maybe self-healing endeavors, a lot of people like to go to natural settings, and that can be, there can be an opening to really taking in and receiving nature in a deeper way that can be afforded by psychedelics. But in terms of the development of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, at least so far as I know, sort of direct incorporation of, say, being out in nature therapeutically, I don't know many instances of that, actually. And the set and setting early on was actually really terrible. Sometimes it would be like, there's actually a story of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre doing mescaline. And this might have been in the 40s or 50s, I think. Mescaline, that's the active ingredient in, say, the cacti peyote or San Pedro, by injection. And it was in like a hospital setting, you have like the bright hospital lights and like white coats and everything, and people having bad experiences in those settings. That has certainly been improved upon, and the settings have now been kind of made comfortable, more aesthetically conducive to having a positive experience. So it's moved in a good direction, but I think that there's probably a lot of headway to be made in terms of like incorporating natural settings or nature into the set and setting itself. I know that it's, walks in nature and engagement with nature is often encouraged as just part of the integrative process now. That's pretty standard in a lot of at least clinical models, but at least within the kind of clinical psychedelic assisted therapy world, there are other forms of practice and work with these medicines that are not in that context and domain, and that do operate with very different principles. But I don't know personally of a lot of incorporation of nature into the sessions or into the work with the psychedelics, like in real time itself.
Thank you.
All right, Sam, do you have any closing thoughts? Warnings?
Yeah, actually something is floating to mind, and this is a big kind of a large thing to drop right now, but it's a very interesting aspect of the history of psychedelic psychotherapy and this idea of like a more broadly cosmically ensouled condition. And yeah, I think I just want to drop it because it's fascinating. A lot of folks will ask, like, how might someone anticipate what sort of content they might be likely to encounter in the course of a psychedelic journey or trip? And this was a challenge that was really central in the early days of say LSD psychotherapy, because psychedelics are really interesting because it's a single compound. When you admit, when one person takes it versus another, they can have radically different experiences. And when the same person takes it at one time and then another time, the content of the journey can be very, very different. And practitioners were really struggling to see if there was any way that people could get some sense of what to anticipate and how to kind of prepare for that. And it just seemed like there was, it's kind of mysterious. And I think to a large extent that's absolutely true. But when Stanislav Grof, one of the pioneers of LSD therapy, was a resident at Esalen, the cultural historian Richard Tarnas went to go study with him. And they were working on this challenge or this problem. And somebody had suggested to Richard Tarnas, oh, you should look at their natal charts, their astrological transits before they go into psychedelic experiences. Rick Tarnas was so uninterested in this that he didn't want to consider it. But eventually they opened up to this notion that actually the most reliable indication of what might come up during a psychedelic experience are somebody's, where your outer planet transits are in relation to your astrological natal chart. And it won't give any concrete predictions of what's going to come up, but it will actually maybe give some archetypal indication of the kind of themes that are going to come up. There's so much that can be unpacked for what might be going on there, but that's one thing I would leave, is that getting some sense of transit astrology when working with psychedelic medicines actually can be really fruitful, and getting a sense of what the archetypal weather is going to be like. So,
Also, where can people follow you, Sam?
Yeah, I have a Twitter account. You can look me up, Sam Hinds, on Twitter. My handle is Revericin, Revericin. I'm pretty quiet on Twitter, but you can reach out to me there if you want to connect. I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us today. Everyone, let's give Sam a muted round of applause. It's really lovely. And thank you for dropping that great symbolic, archetypal, synchronistic wisdom for us to chew on a bit more. We've got some upcoming events at the Golden Shadow. Tomorrow, you can join us for Dialectical Tarot with Meme Analysis and Spear of Fire Tarot. That's a free event where we'll be diving into the Magician card. We have a workshop coming up on the 4 suits of the Minor Arcana on Saturday, May 22nd. And we will be deep diving into the Freud and Jung relationship with Dr. Cadell Last on Sunday, May 23rd. Last but not least, we're diving into Jung's Red Book with Stephen Fox, aka Uber Boyo. So that's on Sunday, June 6th. So more details over at goldenshadow.org. Thanks everybody for attending, and we hope to see you next time.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.